Hello and welcome back to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I'm now joined by Robbin-Coker, and great to have you back in the studio. The last time you were in a ministerial position, you're now in the private sector. Tell me a little bit about the differences. You've seen two very different views of energy and the challenges.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me back. And quite correctly, you have identified that in my prior visit with you, I was in the Ministry of Energy. I ran the ministry. And more recently, I've returned back to the private sector. Now, there's an interesting little story here in that my earliest interventions with government was when I worked for a public-private dialogue facility, which was run by the International Finance Corporation, and the focus was on removing the binding constraints to private sector development. The focus then was very much administrative constraints, but what we quickly realized is that energy was the number one binding constraint. So in many respects, I feel like I've had the opportunity to come from the private sector, go into government, focus on the energy issue, and now I'm back out in the private sector to pull government back into the energy issue, recognizing that private sector has a critical role to play in energy development across Africa, and specifically in the Manu River Union countries, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire, which is the area I'm trying to operate in at this point in time. The challenges are mirrored by the opportunities. Of course, the number one challenge is having the ability as governments to put together the feasibility studies, etc., that allows for the early, like the early stage funding of projects.
Right. Yeah.
Now, there's not a lot of private money for early stage funding. You have some DFIs who will give you some of what you need, especially on the pre-feasibility side. But that focus around moving from pre-feasibility to bankable feasibility remains a very tricky area. Private money is not quite ready to go after that. Governments tend to be a little bit constrained with other competing priorities. But notwithstanding that, I think we're beginning to see some significant headway and more people getting interested in taking the early stage risk.
And you also touched on something that has been a narrative throughout the interviews, particularly with the first one I did with PwC, which is they're seeing one of the mega trends, or they predict one of the mega trends, which is sort of regional and cross-border cooperation when it comes to energy, because you've got an opportunity perhaps in one country and then another country can be an off-taker for that opportunity and things like that. Are you seeing that? Would you sort of corroborate that view?
Absolutely. Let me start with the ongoing initiative called the West African Power Pool, which is an energy market with interconnected lines, managed, sponsored by the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, but orchestrated by what we call the WAP Secretariat, West African Power Pool. Now, some countries, Ghana, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire, for example, have been trading electricity for a while. We now have reached a stage where we're trying to build the interconnector line that will come from Cote d'Ivoire through Liberia into Sierra Leone and out in Guinea. Critical for our overall development, both in terms of...
when that line is built, which, joins everything up, I'm drawing it as a straight line, it probably isn't.
It certainly isn't, and that's a very important consideration. But yes, when that line is built, it enables electricity to be traded between countries, which has to enhance the economics of offtake. If you want to do an IPP in Sierra Leone, you now have the possibility that the power you generate in Sierra Leone can be sold further down the line to the neighboring countries. Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia share a number of things in common. Culturally, we have a lot of similarity. In fact, in some places, we are the same people. In terms of resources, we're all hosting huge deposits of iron ore in particular, and bauxite, and we're all focused on large-scale agriculture. And we all see the future as being our ability to add value to these resources. So electricity becomes fundamental and critical.
Well, you need the energy to,
to
either get them off the ground or change the way agriculture happens. All of that is energy intensive.
Exactly.
And what opportunities are there when we have that interconnectedness in terms of, one of the things that's often said to me is that you've got areas where hydro is a huge potential. You've got other areas where solar is a huge potential. You've got other areas where gas is the right thing. I mean, how joined up can this become?
It can become a lot joined up, but it requires a lot of investment in the planning phase. So the interconnector line currently is, as you said, is not a straight line. It goes through a number of sites which are earmarked because they are good hydro sites. Wonderful. Two issues. Hydro has issues of seasonality. I think in Sierra Leone and perhaps in Liberia as well, you probably will not get more than about 60% load factor out of your hydro because of the dry season, it really becomes very low. This demands that you have to have a base load which is less subject to variation. That's where gas as a possibility comes in. Coal, the dirty word, comes in. There's something called clean coal. Solar as a complement to hydro comes in, but nobody's going to do a 200 megawatt solar farm anytime soon. So building connectivity beyond the major interconnector line becomes critically important. The second very important thing we've discovered in Sierra Leone is the line goes through all the right hydros, but the demand is on the other side of the country.
Right.
So we now have the challenge of interconnectivity from the substations that are built to support the interconnector line to deliver the power where the load is.
Yeah, and that's not just an African issue. I mean, you've got the same issue in Germany, right? You've got all the wind power in the north and all the manufacturing heavy industry in the south. You've got to,
exactly.
And electricity transmission has the laws of physics to deal with as well.
The good news is that you have institutions like the African Development Bank who are very focused now on working with these host country governments via what we call the Mano River Union Secretariat to develop regional projects. So beyond the interconnected line, which African Development Bank is the only financing institution that is funding the development of the line across the 4 countries. What I mean by that is you have other players. Some people are participating in one country but not in another country. African Development Bank is participating in all 4 countries and therefore in a position to take a leadership role. They're also working with the Mano River Union Secretariat around transport infrastructure. I mean, you can do all the iron ore production you want, but if you don't have the ports, if you don't have the railways, if you don't have the roads to move your agricultural produce in an interconnected way, you're going to struggle. The good news with that as well is that if you're building railroads and roadways, then you can deal with right-of-way issues which will allow you to build transmission lines. So the connectivity issue is critical. It's the only way we're going to move forward. The right level of attention is beginning to be paid to it. But of course, private sector, not wanting to overcome too many hurdles, still has reservations around the issue of how you deal with trans-border permitting and trans-border power purchase agreements and dispute resolution between countries, etc. Et
yeah, it almost feels like the private sector wants it laid out on a plate for them and say, well, here you go.
Well, I won't say they want it laid out for them, but capital is a coward.
Yeah.
And they want to reduce the risk as much as possible. And administrative and bureaucratic risks are very real in projects. And you can put a lot of time and energy and effort into a project, but if the wheels of bureaucracy are turning too slowly, it essentially can put a project, grind it to a halt.
Yeah, and so in terms of de-risking that, and another question that kind of immediately comes to mind, and I hope it's not too naive, but if you have, we see this all over the world, so you have this federation or this federated energy approach, probably again not the right words. But is there another issue to overcome? Because if you're a country and you say, right, okay, I need energy, but 80% of my energy, and I'm just plucking numbers to illustrate the point, is coming from a hydro plant that's not in my country. You know, is there that perception of energy security as well? I mean, look, you know, Russia has just cut off the Ukraine. You know, so you ain't paid the bills off. You know, how do you deal with that? Because it must be a very real concern.
Right. It is a very real concern. Energy security has to be a priority for any government, which means you want to ensure that some amount of your energy is locally produced. Now, you don't all have all the resources that we need. So hydro is abundant in the Mano River Union area. But what we really need for energy security is the thermal base load. And I think this is where there's a beautiful opportunity waiting for some enterprising people to get involved with, where gas really is the future. And what makes gas attractive is the fact that you can look at multiple ways of managing your gas supply. Ukraine's problem is that it's a pipeline. In the Mano River Union, we are more likely to pursue a LNG strategy, which requires huge amounts of capital investment in a gas receiving terminal. But once you have that, you can then distribute the gas itself across countries to power plants in these various countries, providing yourself with more energy security. And should you face a problem, for example, where, God forbid, that a boat should sink carrying your gas supplies, getting a new LNG vessel online is fairly quick. What we saw in Ghana last year was they had a break in the pipeline, took about 10 months to fix. In the interim, gas, they had to use heavy fuel oil, $200 million worth of investment which they had not planned for. But energy security is going to be at the heart of how every government thinks about it, and therefore looking at other sources that are more locally, for example, biomass becomes extremely important. We're all big on agriculture, we all have huge agricultural waste, focusing on developing fairly small biomass plants and therefore perhaps distributing on the island grid or mini grid kind of model will enhance energy security.
Well, I've been reading some fascinating stuff about agricultural waste anaerobically generating gas and that being fed into the network. But it strikes me as actually maybe one of the ways of getting energy security is being hyper interconnected. Because in a weird way, where if everybody's reliant on everybody else, that by itself creates more security than when you have isolated and just one connection. If it's hyper connected,
yes, hyper connectivity certainly will take us a long way, but of course managing that hyperconnectivity in terms of the regulatory frameworks, the administrative bottlenecks, making sure that we all have similar attitude to respecting the rule of law, those become critical. And of course, in the Mano River Union, we have 2 Francophone countries and 2 Anglophone countries. And Francophone law is perhaps a little different from Anglophone
it's got
jurisprudence. So we have to manage that.
Hasn't it? Yeah.
And that is going to be a process that takes time. In the interim, whilst we plan for that kind of hyper connectivity, I think each country has an opportunity to leverage gas in particular through a centralized gas receiving and then distributed gas supply, and enable themselves to have a stable base load that they can control at all times.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our time in the studio. Oluniyi, it's always a pleasure talking to you. It was a pleasure talking to you last year, and those are sort of great insights. And you're in the private sector now. So I wish you a lot of luck with your luck is the wrong word, but it's meant in the right way with your new company and your new enterprise.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for watching. You can maybe hear in the background noise, we're about to break for lunch. I know I could do with some. I'm sure you.
I certainly can.
You could as well. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you on the next interview.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Adam.
No problem.